I want to be the first one to admit that I made a ton of mistakes when I did my first build of Azlask the Swelling Scourge. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I feel like this particular commander is a little bit pushed down with the crazy potential of Ulalek. And Ulalek, for those of you that aren't aware, is the face commander for the new 5-color Eldrazi Precon. And Azlask is actually the secondary commander, sort of like the lieutenant of that deck. But we are here today to talk about Azlask, and it's a really interesting commander because it prioritizes and rewards you for playing out a wide board, which is something that Eldrazi don't typically do or not typically associated with. Most of the time, we are sort of having our payoff in the form of some large Eldrazi like the Ulamogs, Kozileks of the world, etc. But today, let's go over Azlask. So this is a 3-mana commander. So the color identity is actually all 5 colors. It's Wooburg, but it's a colorless commander, importantly. And then whenever this or another colorless creature you control dies, get an experience counter, which it just goes on you, not the creature. And then you can pay Wooburg, so white, blue, black, red, green. And then you get the ability creatures you control get +X, where X is the number of experience counters you have. And then Scions and Spawns you control get Indestructible and Annihilator 1 until end of turn. So it's pretty sweet that we get to utilize the old experience counters, and we also sort of have this win condition just sitting in the command zone where you can pay Wooburg to pump your entire board. Now, as a reminder, the Eldrazi, Scion, and Spawns are the ones that actually get the Annihilator 1 and Indestructible. Everything else just gets buffed. But in my experience, a lot of the time when playing this deck, you're going to have 10, 15, sometimes 20 or more experience, and there's ways where we can loop it infinitely to get infinite experience to then run our opponents over with our commander's secondary ability. But I really want to take a moment to go over the mistakes that I made with this commander. There's actually a lot of them. We're going to prioritize 3 in particular that I made with my initial build path. It actually took one of my other friends, his name is Elijah, and he'll be on the channel eventually. We're going to start doing gameplay at some point, and he's going to be on the channel as one of the players. And he sat me down and said, this is actually what is wrong with your deck. These are the things that you need to fix and focus on. And I think sometimes you need that outside perspective to really slap some sense into you. And I hope that you, the viewer, can learn from my mistakes so you can have a much better, more consistent play experience with this commander. And I promise you, with this updated deck list, you will. First and foremost, my friend Elijah said something to me that really struck me, and that is we're not actually playing a 5-color deck. We're playing a 6-color deck, and that just makes sense because there's a lot of cards, especially ones that have been printed recently, that require colorless mana specifically in order to be cast. So not only do we have to worry about getting Wooburg, we also have to worry about getting Wooburg plus colorless. It's not Wooburg without colorless. We absolutely need the colorless to function in some of the specific cards in this deck. And that is quite the enigma. It really changes up how we approach the deck building process and especially the mana base. So let's talk about that. Initially, when I did my run through of the deck, I had every single Pain land, and you know what those are. They tap for colorless or they tap for one of 2 colors, but you take 1 life, hence Pain lands. I had all 10 of them in there because, well, they make colorless and they give access to our colors. But it turns out that wasn't really the best choice. And I would encourage you to stick with me here because those Pain lands are great and we're going to incorporate some of them, but it is absolutely, I would argue, incorrect to include all of them. And that's because when we break down our deck at the end of the day and we look at the color pip percentage in our deck, we actually don't need access to certain Pain lands, in particular the ones that don't give us access to blue or green. And that's going to be the main consideration for sort of the remainder of the deck build, is that our mana base needs to be primarily focused around blue and green pips once we sort of finalize what our bulk of the cards in the deck are going to be. So with that in mind, I had to really swallow my pride with this deck and include things like the fetch lands, the triomes, and of course the shock lands. So with that in mind, I sat down initially and I really wanted to make the deck work without them, but I think it's not that it's impossible because you can build a functioning deck without those lands. But again, we're in 6 color. We really need access to not only Wooburg, but also colorless. It's a really fine balance to strike, and if we don't have access to our colors to get certain very important Eldrazi out at an earlier stage of the game to start generating our spawns and scions, then we're just going to be in a really bad place and you're going to have a bad play experience. My friend Elijah said something to the effect of, the mana base doesn't necessarily break the deck. It makes the deck more consistent, and the cards that actually put in the work are the other cards in the 99, not the mana base. And I really do agree with that sentiment. The reason that I tend to not include these cards is because they're expensive, quite frankly, and people don't want to shell out over $400 for a mana base. But for this particular build and version of the deck, because we're going for sort of a maximized efficiency type of build for this WUBRG plus colorless commander, I did include all of those lands in our particular list. Mistake number 2 that I made was that I didn't include enough efficient card draw in the deck. So, because we're in a creature heavy deck, we have to focus in on cards that draw us off of our creatures, but there's a lot of consideration there. There's more than you might think. And I viewed a lot of other people's deck lists online when I was sort of finalizing my version, and I didn't really see a lot of that in the deck proper itself. It was more focused around the kindred or tribal type of build paths, and not really focusing on the creatures themselves. But we're generating a ton of little Eldrazi. So my question is, why wouldn't we want to focus on those things? And sure enough, once I included specific versions of them, the deck percentage or the deck conversion rate of winning actually went up substantially. So what different effects do we have? We have Beastmaster type effects, which just draw whenever you cast a creature. We have Welcoming Vampire type effects, which draw when a creature of a low power comes into the board. And then we have the Elemental Bond and Garruk's Uprising effects, which typically require higher powered creatures to be entering the battlefield in order to trigger draw. Now, Garruk's Uprising is additionally a consideration strictly because it also gives our creatures trample, which sometimes matters. But I ultimately went with the Welcoming Vampire style of effects, and also the token generation type of effects like Benny Brax. So Benny Brax and Welcoming Vampire basically summarize my thoughts on card draw for this deck. We want cards that are going to draw us when our little guys come into the board, and also that synergize with the production of our tokens, because we have over 20 plus cards in the deck that actually care about or make tokens themselves. So that is a good percentage of the deck that we can focus on and capitalize in our draw package. If I wanted to make the deck just deadly consistent, of course, I would include things like Rhystic Study, but that's not a lot of fun for me. And same thing with Smothering Tithe. I left that out because people get really, really salty when they see that. And at least if you're running the fetch lands and triomes and stuff, people will be like, oh, look at that baller over there spending money. But if you have things like Rhystic Study and Smothering Tithe, they just irritate people at the table. I purposely left that type of stuff out, especially the Rhystic Studies for draw. I did include a Mystic Remora because I find that card much more, I'll use the word fair, just because it has a cumulative upkeep. It, sometimes does nothing, especially if you're in more of a creature heavy meta. And I think it's just a cheaper, more economical way for you to get in some efficient card draw for the 1 mana slot. So I would include Mystic Remora, but we left out the Rhystic Studies. Now, I think this one's probably going to rustle some people's jimmies a little bit. It is about cost reduction. So if you look at the EDH rec page for Azlask, you're going to see some very, very strong tribal/kindred cost reduction crop up, namely in the form of Ugin the Spirit Dragon, or I'm sorry, not Ugin the Spirit Dragon, the other one, the other Ugin. We have Urza's Incubator, and then also Herald's Horn. Now, Ugin, unfortunately, in my testing, is just awful. So when you are getting to the point where you want to be playing out something for 6 mana, you have to pray that Ugin sticks around until your next turn. And there's plenty of effects, at least in the groups that I play in, that can remove my Planeswalker outright, or people just get around the fact that I have a lot of little blockers. And on top of that, we would love to keep around our little Eldrazi spawn and Scion until our next turn in order to utilize them for tapping effects like Cryptolith Rite, so we can abuse the double mana potential that they have. So we don't want to necessarily be throwing them in front of blockers or in front of creatures to block, because we want to keep them around. So I found that Ugin was just terrible. I cannot recommend it. I don't think it's a good addition in the deck because our deck is much lower to the ground. We have very few cards in the deck that are going to be 7+ mana, and even when we are casting those cards, oftentimes it's to the benefit of generating additional spawn or scion in the deck to forward the game plan of getting experience counters and then buffing and killing the board. I think Ugin just detracts from that. It's good if we have a lot of generic cost reduction in the deck, but we don't. And moreover, this is why I also didn't include Urza's Incubator. So I think I can wrap in Urza's Incubator and Herald's Horn in one package here. So they both are heavily reliant on the total number of creatures that we have in the deck that are specific to a type. But it turns out that these cards are just far too inconsistent. If we have only around like 20 or less cards that are actually Eldrazi, I would much rather have something that's going to be more mana positive in the deck over a period of time, even something as simple as just another mana rock, because the Urza's Incubator of the world will need at least 2 creatures being cast in order for it to go net positive in mana. And to be quite transparent, we have a lot of effects in this deck that are enchantments or instants and sorceries that are going to generate us our little scion and spawn, and that does not actually work with Urza's Incubator or the Herald's Horn. So in my testing, those cards were actually extremely lackluster. They underperformed, and once I took them out, the deck just worked much better. So I would encourage you to actually leave these cards on the cutting room floor and instead optimize around some other cost reducers, or in a better word, probably just another rock, which we'll go over. So I went over my mistakes. So what's good about this deck at this point? Let's just piggyback off of our last point and let's talk about our ramp effects in the deck. So because we put in more triomes and shocklands in this deck, that means cards like Farseek, Nature's Lore, etc. are at a premium. They're very improved, and I would much rather have those than something like an Urza's Incubator, let's say. So that immediately got slotted in place of those cards. But what about some other sort of generically good cards, in particular bodies to help protect or block or that type of thing? And there's a new card that was recently printed. I've already sort of gushed about it on another one of my videos, but that's White of the Reliquary. So this is literally just a crop rotation on a stick, and it just grows throughout the game when creatures end up in our graveyard. It's been great. I really enjoy this card. We're not in a land-heavy deck, but the ability to get out a blocker at an early stage of the game and then capitalize off of the fact that we're making little spawn to then tutor out lands that will stick around for the entire game, in particular any lands, like a Triome, for instance, is incredible. I'd really encourage you to play White of the Reliquary. It's overperformed time and time again in my playtesting, and I think you should really consider it. And likewise, this card was just reprinted. It's gone up a smidgen since it got reprinted when it hit its low, but that's Uro. So if you're not familiar with Uro already, it's a 3-mana Simic. It's actually a commander. It's a legendary creature. It's a 6/6, and when it enters the battlefield, sacrifice it unless it escaped. And for those to remember, escape is you pay 2 green, 2 blue, exile 5 from your graveyard, and then you can cast it from your graveyard. But the important part here is the middle effect, which is whenever it ETBs or attacks, by the way, you gain 3 life, draw a card, and put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. And it doesn't have to come in tapped if it's a non-tap land. So it gives you immediate access to the mana if you need it. This card's great. I've really loved Uro, and I haven't put it into really any of my decks because, quite frankly, it was too expensive for the effect that I was going for. But in this case, it was recently reprinted, and I think it's worth a look at this point in time, in particular for this particular deck, because it allows us to sustain. It gives us life gain. It allows us to put lands onto the battlefield, and then at a later stage, it allows us to get a decent-sized blocker, a 6/6, for the relatively low cost of exiling things out of our graveyard. It's been a killer, so I'd really recommend including Uro as well. There's also been some new cards that have been printed. I just want to go over 2 of them in particular because they're pretty sweet. One of them is Writhing Chrysalis, and so Writhing Chrysalis, you probably already know it. It's 4 mana, so 2 in Gruul colors for a devoid 2/3 Eldrazi drone. And then whenever you cast this spell, so importantly, this can't be blinked with our Eldrazi Displacer, which is in the list. It has to be cast. You make 2 0/1 Eldrazi spawn, and it has reach. Why? I don't know, because it's a card printed in 2024. And then whenever you sack another Eldrazi, you put a 1/1 counter on this. Really, we're playing it for the fact that it's a 4 mana 2/3 with reach that brings 2 bodies along with it, which then can be, generated into experience counters at a later time. card is just good. And even though it's just a common, from MH3, I still think it makes it into our 5-color Eldrazi deck because it has such good synergy. It helps us, sort of sustain in the early to mid game because it presents blockers on board for our opponents. It's just good. And for that reason, we also have to talk about another one, which is Glaring Fleshtaker. Now, this is 2 and a colorless. This is why we need our colorless lands in the deck. And yes, the spawn will also count for that. But at an early stage, it helps to just get this out with like our Karplusan Forest, for instance, instead of an Eldrazi spawn. This is an Eldrazi drone for 3 mana. It's a 2/2. Whenever you cast a colorless spell, you just make an Eldrazi spawn. And then whenever another colorless creature enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. This card is dealt 10 plus damage in 1 turn cycle because of the ability to generate spawn. It also acts as a win condition if we hit one of our infinite combos in the deck, which I will go over in just a moment with you. It's just a generically good card that has intense, great synergy with all the cards in our deck. And importantly, with all these things we've talked about so far, we don't need the commander to really enable all of these abilities. They function well on their own, and they hold their own in the early to mid game, which allows us to progress into the late game to overwhelm our opponents with our commander once we need it. So before we get into the infinite combo, I just want to talk about the counterspell package in this deck. I did include a mana drain. I don't think it's fully necessary, but it produces colorless mana, which matters for our deck. And I think if we're looking at optimizing, obviously we would have even better counter magic in the deck. I mean, Mana Drain is arguably one of the best we can include for our version of the deck. But I included Mana Drain specifically because it just makes the generic mana. If you want to leave it out and just put a counter spell or some other, counter magic in the deck, that's fine. I completely understand where you're coming from. But I also included cards like Remand and Arcane Denial. Now, I like Remand because I have the fun FNM art. It's pretty sweet. But on top of that, it also is a replacement counter spell. So not only does this counter, but it also helps make people feel not as bad because it returns it to their hand, and it just draws you. It replaces itself. And that's really the main reason why I'm including certain counterspells like this and Arcane Denial in the deck, because we want the card selection. We want to be able to control the flow of the board, i.e. we can counter something, but we also want to be able to replace it once it's gone, and I've been extremely happy. I would encourage you to give Remand a try in Commander if you have not yet already. All right, so it's infinite combo time. Let's talk about this very briefly. It involves Eldrazi Displacer because of course it does. Why would it not? And also a Brood Monitor or Emmercool's Hatcher. So if we have this on the battlefield, the Displacer, and then one of these on the battlefield already, or we cast it, etc. on our turn, what we can basically do immediately is make infinite experience if our commander is already on the board. That's because the Displacer can continuously use the 3 Eldrazi spawn that enter the battlefield under our control to then pay into its ability to blink this card over and over and over again, and on enter the battlefield trigger, these 2 cards, the Hatcher and then also the Monitor, are going to make 3 more Eldrazi spawn to keep the loop going. So we get infinite experience so that at a later stage in the game, we can buff for infinite and then hopefully kill everybody. It's even better if we have one of our doublers out on the battlefield like a Parallel Lives or Anointed Procession, because quite frankly, those cards are pretty busted anyway, and they allow us to just go infinite, more or less, because we're going to be netting an additional 3 Eldrazi spawn, and if it gets back to our turn, or if we have a way to enable haste in the deck, etc., it means that basically everybody dies on the spot. So I've been very, impressed. I thought the Displacer was going to end up on the cutting room floor, but it has a lot of utility. It protects our board. It has infinite combo synergy in the deck. There's a lot of ETB things in here. Plus, it's like a decently statted body for 3 mana. So I've been quite impressed with this. Oh, and it's devoid, so it triggers our commander when it dies and has synergy with the other colorless cards that care about colorless in our deck. So really can't recommend this card enough in addition to the others. And then let's get on to one last thing before we close out this video. So I have them right here. Okay, so I'm missing Marin of Clan Neltoth. However, that doesn't matter. We have Minthara and Azuri Claw of Progress. So both of these guys are almost like alternative commanders in the deck because they also generate experience. And the cool thing is they both have really, really good synergy with the rest of our deck without needing our commanders. So you can play out a Minthara at an earlier stage in the game if you wanted. I tend to use her more as a finisher because when we already have a bunch of experience, the little guys are already being buffed. So if we don't have our commander out, but we have, let's say, 20 experience, her last ability says creatures you control get +1/+0 for each experience you have, meaning all of our little spawns are going to say, oh, I am now a 21. not 21. They're just 20 attack, 1 power, or 1 toughness, for instance. It acts as sort of a quasi finisher. And in the same way, Azuri is just like a slew of experience generation in our deck because we have so many ways to produce tokens. And on top of that, we get to make something else big to then get in, hopefully, for damage, in particular on like a trampler, let's say, or something along those lines. They've been just very good. And for the same reason, Marin of Clan Neltoth is just a stud in this deck. She does incredible things time and time again, brings back key cards at my end step. It makes the deck much more resilient. I would not run the deck without those 3 experienced commanders in the deck in addition. So I would really make sure that you give them a look and give them the respect that they deserve because they're really good in our deck and they allow it to function without our commander, which is pretty sweet. So I do just want to take 1 second just to point out, I do have things like Doubling Season, Anointed Procession, Parallel Lives in the deck. And I know that I've put out videos in the past that sort of specify that these cards aren't that great. And it's true. I don't really love these cards. They're not needed in the deck. If you want to cut them, I think that that's actually one of the first cards I would cut. Now, the only reason that I've included them is that, I mean, yes, they can go infinite with Eldrazi Displacer, but so doesn't everything. The other reason is the fact that I use them as a finisher, and I would encourage you to do the same. So I use them at a later stage in the game when I've already sort of set myself up. I've had card draw in the early stages. I've controlled the flow of the game, either with my counter magic or sort of my board presence, etc. And then I play them before I'm about to generate a lot of tokens, or I hold it in my hand until I have the infinite combo, etc. Don't just run it on the board to run it on the board. Have a plan and ensure that there is some follow-up. And if you do have to run it out, ensure that your next turn, you're going to be playing something like Emrakul's Hatcher or one of the other cards that generates 3+ tokens. So that way you can get a ton of extra value off of it in the event, or you can at least plan around it in the event that it's going to get removed, or you can sort of maximize the use of it before that it gets removed. I think that that's the best way to use those cards. And I really have to stress, do not just run them on the board dry with nothing out there to support them, or no counter magic in your hand, or no follow-up plan, because that's really the worst way to use them. And I think you'll increase your win percentage if you start holding them up for a bigger play at a later stage in the game. All right, let me get off my soapbox. I think we're all set with this deck tech or deck video. I hope you got something out of it, and I really think that you should give this commander a try with the present deck list. I would like you to maybe just print out the cards or proxy in the fetches and shocks and stuff like that just to see what the flow of the deck looks like, because with the current deck list, it took me many weeks of testing to get here, and I think that this is sort of the more optimal list that you will be happy playing. It's just up to sort of your play group if they're okay with including those types of higher, budgetary lands in the deck. But I really want you to give it a try as is. So I'd encourage you to give the list a try before you modify the mana base. And of course, I really want to just thank everybody. It's been a crazy few last days of views and wonderful comments. People are really killing it on that front. I really want to thank everybody for doing that. It means the world to me. And if you can continue to comment on this video, like it, and share it with your friends, especially if you think I did a good job with this version of the deck list in the video, I'd really appreciate it. And stick around for my next one because we still have more videos this week coming up, so many more. And at the end of it, I've already recorded it. I just need to edit it down at this point. A full 100 commander breakdown on this upcoming Friday. So be on the lookout for that. And if you're watching this after the fact, after it's already out, go watch it. It's going to be cool. I go over a ton of commanders. I have a lot of insight into the commanders that I've played, and I'm really pumped about that video. So that's it for this one. I'll see you guys really soon in the next video. I've been Kyle. See you later. Bye.